Hazlerig, and this is the Hypnosis 247 Live Network, and this is Trancing in the Sheets. And today I have an amazing guest, but before I go over to him, just to let you know, when you join the network, you were sent an email, and on that email is a link. And if you go and click on that link, you will receive a $200 gift card that you can use in a variety of hotels, car hire, and all kinds of things. And if you're interested in learning how those kinds of travel vouchers could help your business, then just put solutions in the box below and we'll send you out some information. But over to today's guest on Trancing in the Sheets. He is based over in Austin, Texas, over in the USA. He is our master storyteller, a master of metaphor. He is the master of the Order of Spellbinding Storytellers. Sounds like he's the master of everything, really. He has been known to go and tell stories and use metaphors when helping people in jail and also in recovery centres. He's also one of the nicest and talented hypnotists I ever had the opportunity of working with. I taught with him last year at HypnoThoughts Live, and I would like to welcome James Hazlerig to the show today. I think it's Hazlerig. I can never pronounce your surname, James.
Hazlerig. Hazlerig. It's just
right.
Like a hazel tree.
That's all right. I've got it right then. That's great. Thanks ever so much for coming on Trancing in the Sheets and talking to us today.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
So you are well known for being the master storyteller. You know, if people talk about metaphor, the use of metaphor and storytelling in the modern hypnosis world, you know, your name is always top of the list. How did you kind of get into storytelling in the first place?
So that's a great question. You know, I grew up hearing stories constantly from my father, and he told a lot of stories of his childhood and his ancestors. So I was absorbing this storytelling quality, and he would, you know, we talk about nested loops where you kind of hit a certain point and then you stop, you do something else, and then you come back to it. He'd be right in the middle of a story at the dinner table and suddenly stop, leave the table, go out into the garage, mess around with his woodworking equipment, come back in, sit down and pick up right where he left off. And all of us kids were like, wow, what did Dad just do? But we all were hanging on to those words. So then when I was 18, I went off to college, and I fell in with a group of people who love to dress up in medieval clothes and hit each other with sticks and wear armor and things like that. And I was pretty lousy at hitting other people with sticks. I'm not a very athletic guy. But at night, we would all gather around a campfire. And of course, we, you know, didn't have boom boxes or televisions or phones. At that point, there weren't even smartphones. Mm-hmm. So we would tell each other stories. And that's really where I started to develop this ability. And I started to notice that people responded to stories in certain ways. For instance, I would set a goal for myself. I wonder if on this hot afternoon in Texas in the summer, I can get these people to shiver. And I didn't know that I was eliciting hypnotic phenomena when I was doing that. I also was lucky enough to have an apprenticeship to a master storyteller in that organization. And she really taught me a lot about how stories influence behavior. Mm. And she would even give me a task. She'd say, all right, so we need people in our organization to think more about this thing or to do more of this. What stories can you start telling that are going to influence people's behavior? And so I got to really take all this stuff on, learn all of it. And then I got interested in hypnosis and went to training and realized, oh, I've been doing this. I've already been using hypnosis. I've been doing group hypnosis when I'm doing stories. I'd been using individual hypnosis for myself and for other people because, you know, our identity really is just a story. that we're telling ourselves. And the way that I think of helping people with hypnosis is that they come in with a bad story and I help them step into a better story.
I mean, it's actually one of the phrases we sometimes use, isn't it, during a, kind of an intake or initial consultation, or tell me your story. We say that to people, what brings you here? Tell me your story. And, I guess in a way, that way, they can tell you it like it's a story as well. And it immediately becomes, in some ways, less distressing because they're telling it to you as a story rather than an interview, which can be quite intimidating. So I guess we use storytelling right across the board with hypnosis. I hadn't actually realized that until just this very moment, James. That's what we do.
Right.
So when did you, I mean, we do, I know when you talk about how do we influence people with stories, and I guess we do that, like you were saying, like your father did. We've done that for centuries, haven't we, with children? We tell them stories, it's the moral of the story, isn't it? And I guess, with this, maybe it's more the purpose of the story rather than the moral of it in some ways, or what the metaphor behind it is, which is the other thing, which I know you're extraordinarily talented at, is not just taking metaphors, but building them, really personalizing them for your clients. I remember, when we taught a class together at HTL last year, which was using storytelling and metaphor for the treatment of sexual, it was for erectile dysfunction, wasn't it, in particular? And I know you told a story of one of the stories that you did, but you actually created the most amazing story and metaphor by just being given specifics from the audience that were attending our lecture, which you did just straight off the top of your head. I remember I was like stood back going, wow, that's amazing. So, but I know you have, do you tend to have stories and metaphors that you fall back to that you use over and over again? And then how do you go about personalizing those for each individual client, if you do?
Right. So, yeah, I definitely have what I like to think of as my stable of domesticated metaphors, and the stories that are in my collection. And the beautiful thing is that you can change a story to fit a particular client, whether it's as simple as changing the gender of the main character to match theirs, or somehow finding a correlation between the characters in it and the person that you're talking to. For instance, I tell a story about a couple of monks, and I used to love to tell this story in the jail because I'd say the monks have had to take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Poverty means when they entered, they had to give up all their possessions and sleep in a tiny little cell. And they had to wear a uniform that's boring. And I look around at all the guys in their jail uniforms, right? Chastity, they cannot touch a woman. And they're all like, oh, yeah, I know, right? And obedience, they have to do what they're told. So, even though that story wasn't written for people in a jail, except that we're all sort of metaphorically in a jail, I was able to tie it in with them. Now, there's also what I like to call my wild metaphors. And those are the metaphors that the clients walk in with, or they're the metaphors that kind of come into my mind when I'm working with a client. And, honestly, I need to listen to the recording of that class again because I'd completely forgotten that I spun some sort of metaphor right there for them. What I remember was what I came into it with, which was a metaphor and a metaphorical story I had woven for a client who had erectile dysfunction. And that's the thing, really. And I know that you're much more comfortable, and I think this might partly be just persona and possibly the fact that you're a woman. I don't know. You can get away with being a lot more frank about a lot of sexual things. As a man, especially in our modern society, I have to be very gentle and kind of metaphorical when I'm talking about a lot of these things. So that's when metaphor is really handy because it is that language of the unconscious.
Absolutely. And I remember, I'm saying I remember, I'm fairly certain I remember, I think the metaphor that you use for your kind of domestic metaphor that that it now is, I'm guessing
All right.
a lot of domestic metaphors come from wild metaphors, because there's something that comes up and then you can
Yes,
be purposely
they become domesticated.
But I think it was to do with a wolf.
Yeah. So this was it was really an amazing case. The young man, very athletic, very good looking, came in and he said that he had an issue with erectile dysfunction. And as always happens, that becomes a story, right? And the story he starts telling himself is, there's something wrong with me. This is going to happen every single time. And he described the situation, and basically he had been what we call a player, right? You know, he'd been with a lot of women and never had any problems. And then all of a sudden, in the middle of making love to this woman, he realized that he was deeply in love with her. And suddenly the kind of, you know, the wolf, the bad boy, the player went out the window, and along with it went his erection. And so I wove this metaphor about a wolf and an angel, and realizing that we have both in us, and the wolf and the angel in him could come together. They could meet with the wolf and the angel in this woman that he loves, and the four of them could combine to make love.
Oh, I remember it was such a wonderful way, and I know that the outcome for that with that particular client was extremely successful, wasn't it? You know,
Yeah, he came to his second session with a huge smile on his face.
and certainly storytelling and metaphor. Certainly since, you know, I came across a lot of your work a couple of years ago, actually, a good few years ago. You know, it is a really useful thing, because sometimes, as frank as I am, and I am well known for being very direct and frank and tell it how it is, you know, for some clients that's just not going to work, and they do need a much more storytelling, kind of softly kind of approach. And, you know, I often find, I think, you know, when somebody's giving me their story and I know I need to tell them one, I often think, well, what will James do? What would James say?
Oh.
So, but it works, you know, because I can kind of get into that kind of Hazlerig storytelling mindset, and because it's just drawing those real kind of little lines and nuggets, isn't it, from the things that our clients tell us, to be able to spin it back to them, because one, it's already their own language, but it's done in such a way that it means something different to them then. And I think that's a really beautiful thing, isn't it, you know?
Yeah, and I'm touched that you ask yourself, WWJD, what would James do? And you know, and I find myself channeling various other hypnotists depending on what I'm doing as well. And I had some brilliant other thought about that, but I'm just amused by WWJD. You know, the thing is that our clients, they need some way to step out of their situation, look at it from a different angle. And that's what stories let us do. Stories let us live vicariously through someone else. So when we're able to create a story that involves somebody solving an analogous problem, or discovering, making a realization. Just sometimes you just have to look at something from a different angle. And, you know, they say when you change the way you look at something, the things you look at change. So if you, I don't know how many listeners would be familiar with like the Overdurf meta pattern of change concept, but basically John Overdurf says that in almost any change work, you start out with the client associated into their problem, then you dissociate them from it, which allows them to look at things differently, and then you associate them into a resource state. And what I love about stories is that they really do that, because the minute you hear once upon a time, or the minute that you have a feeling that somebody's telling a story, you set aside what's going on for you, and you get to become Luke Skywalker or whoever it is, right? You get to become Little Red Riding Hood.
Mm-hmm.
And then as that character, you get to discover those resources, and you get to have insights about what's going on for you, which you then get to carry over, because of course the last step of that model is collapse, where you take that resource state and you combine it with the original problem state. So you're applying those resources to the problem, which no longer is a problem anymore. Mm. So stories let us do that in a way. And I mean, I use plenty of approaches that are not storytelling and metaphor. It's always part of this complete program. Mm. But it's really kind of a multi-tool. You can use it in so many different ways.
Well, you can use it, I mean, certainly even just as sometimes even just as an induction, isn't it? You know, without the client, it's almost like an induction of an induction, like a pre-induction almost, where, you know, you can just tell a client, even if you're telling a client a story about another client, it might not be, you know, it might be just a story, but, you know, we can also say, well, I had this client once, or somebody told me about a client they had that had something similar. And you kind of then just tell them a story about that client that isn't necessarily related to the issue, but immediately they start to kind of start drawing those parallels. And of course, when we have, you know, like we say, like we're all rooting for Luke Skywalker. We're always rooting for, you know, the kind of lead character in the story, aren't we? We want them to overcome whatever it was. We want them to get better. We want them to be the hero. And of course, then what they start to do is to root for themselves a bit more, which, you know, is often where people are lacking, isn't it? They'll believe in the character when sometimes they won't believe in themselves. And then when we collapse that back in and we give them that as the resource state, then that's all part of the resource state, along with any other kind of things that we're then doing. It's an extraordinarily powerful thing, isn't it? You know, we see stories sometimes as just being a story, when actually, you know, especially the way you do it, James, you know, it's so cleverly interwoven with so much hypnotic language and, you know, that all the kind of suggestions that are in there. And of course, when we naturally as children go into a hypnotic state when we're listening to stories. So we know how to do that as an adult. Mm-hmm. You know, it's a familiar and often a very safe and happy time. You know, we often have good memories attached to when we would sit and listen to the teacher or your grandparents or your mum or whoever it was at, you know, at whatever time of day, where, you know, that quiet time, that's why I have story time at the end of the day at school, isn't it? Just mm-hmm. really time to calm down. So in terms of how often would you use storytelling and metaphor? Says a percentage wise with your clients, how often does it come into play? I know by far it's not the only thing that you use many things, but is it something you would use most sessions?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I'm trying to imagine a session in which I wouldn't use at least some. I'm pretty sure that with 100% of my clients, I'm going to use some storytelling and some metaphor. It's certainly not 100% of the approach that I use. There are times when I will do, you know, almost a much more kind of street hypnosis approach, depending on what the client's looking for, you know. And I spend a lot of time watching Sean Michael Andrews' videos and learning from him, that kind of thing. There are times when it's going to be much more sort of an NLP kind of intervention, but with pretty much every story, or with every client, who always is a story, with every client, I've probably used some stories in the pre-talk to prime the change, to help them to reframe situations. With some story, or with with some clients, I'm going to tell them a story while their eyes are closed, while they're officially in trance. And of course, I'm going to use some other processes at the same time. Some of those might be metaphorical processes, or some of them might be very direct. At times, I'll use several stories nested and then get to a point where I'm just using straight direct suggestion.
Mm-hmm.
And even then, I like to sort of have the person imagine that they're standing at a canyon, and that everything they say gets echoed back to them tenfold, so that even as they're repeating these direct suggestions in their mind, they're sort of visualizing and imagining that everything around them is vibrating with it. And sometimes I'm going to tell a story to a client after they've opened their eyes and they're officially out of trance. And the thing is that, yes, yeah, I like that you acknowledge that I use a lot of embedded suggestions, a lot of hypnotic language, and I know how to nest a story inside another story. And these things aren't nearly as mysterious as most people think, but really just a story, just an anecdote. And I think almost every hypnotist says, oh yeah, I had a client who had a similar situation, or I heard of somebody who had a similar situation. And just giving that client that glimmer of hope, that moment of vicariously experiencing it, they naturally do go into trance when they hear a story. I like to say that the most powerful induction in the world is only 4 words: once upon a time. So by telling them a couple of stories before we have them officially close their eyes, we're fractionating, right? So, there are people who are like, well, if I just tell my client a story, they're not really going to appreciate what I've done. Sure, that's a hazard. I had a client who came to me and said, well, I went to this guy and I feel like all he did was sit there and talk. I don't feel like anything really happened, and he hadn't gotten the results he wanted. So I said, well, what do you think needs to happen? In other words, what story are you telling yourself? And he said, well, like on stage when people, get their feet stuck to the floor or forget their name or whatever. So I said, okay, well, let's do that. So I did a street hypnosis routine with him, basically, and then gave him some very direct suggestions. Worked like a charm. At the same time, beforehand, I had primed him with a couple of stories about clients I had helped with similar situations.
Absolutely. And I guess that's the importance of knowing your client's story, isn't it? I know we can work in a content-free way, but we still need to know our client's story, as in at least what their expectations are, or how they came to be in the therapist's office. I think, because everybody has a story to tell, don't they? Everybody has a story to tell. Yeah,
they do. And sometimes, especially people who've been to conventional talk therapists, they've rehearsed their story so much that they are continually hypnotizing themselves into having problems. And so sometimes I have to take a page from Melissa Cheers, and when the client, I do think that people need to be heard. And there's some people who say, I don't care what their conscious mind has to say, that's not where the problem is, just ignore all that. I think people do need to be heard, right? They're not really going to care how much you know until they know how much you care. But I've had clients who get all the way through their story and then they loop back around and start telling it again. And that's when I love to go, stop. You've already told me that. And the look on their face is amazing. and I say, okay, we're going to have a new story now. We're going to change these things. So, it's just a frame that I look at the world through, but I think it's a very useful one with our clients.
And I would agree wholeheartedly. I think, it's just a really lovely way sometimes of delivering, and a very gentle way sometimes of delivering what we need to do to a particular client, isn't it? And we can tell actually some of the most, within that, the stories aren't always aren't always beautiful, as in, sometimes there's some pretty grisly things that can happen in those stories, but the client takes what they need away from that. And of course, always, hopefully, at the end of all those stories and their story, that, there's a change that's been made, and and everybody is feeling much better and happier and in a much better place. We're out of time, but I'm sure I can hook you back in if I ask very nicely for you to come and talk to us again on Trancing the Sheets. Thank you so much for being here. Where can people find what you do? Where can they find out more about you? What's your kind of website and social media and all that kind of stuff?
Sure. So in terms of websites, I know it's a slightly long URL, but it's hypnoticstorytellingcourse.com. And that's where I'm putting my courses on hypnotic storytelling. The big one, the kind of the flagship product, hasn't been released yet. I'm going to release it on Cyber Monday, but there's some other things there that are really great. And the Order of Spellbinding Storytellers, which is a Facebook group, that's where a lot of that information comes out, and that's where we like to share ideas. I have a podcast, which is called the Hypnotic Stories Podcast. Nice, simple title. And I'm up to 12 episodes now. I plan to release some more fairly soon. I'm not prolific like Jason Linett, but I think that if you like storytelling, if you're into this, if you want to explore more of it, it's a great thing to listen to that. And I really want to just encourage people to realize that everyone tells stories. We all do this. A lot of people say, "Oh, I just can't do what you do," and yet, all right, yet maybe you don't do it to the same degree. But there was a time when you were crawling on the floor and you looked at grown-ups and you didn't say, "Oh, I don't think I'll ever be able to walk," right? You figured out how to walk. You learned. And listening to examples, thinking about it, breaking it down, anybody can learn to do these things. And I encourage all hypnotists to learn it because it's going to make you more effective.
Mm-hmm. And anything that makes us more effective, and it's just practice, isn't it? Just practice makes perfect. Thanks so much for coming on and talking to us today, James. I so appreciate it. And if you've enjoyed today's show, which how could you not enjoy spending time with James Hazlerig? But there are also 8 other hosts, or there's 8 of us, I should say, of which I am one. And Sean Michael Andrews is another, the world's fastest hypnotist, and that have some amazing guests on talking about all kinds of wonderful things, street hypnosis, hypnosis in the entertainment world, and all kinds of other amazing things. So please do go and check out his show and the other shows on the Hypnosis 247 Live Network. And I'll see you next time on Trancing the Sheets. Thanks for joining us.